in the 16th century when Martin Luther nailed his 95 theses on the wall of that church in Gothenburg. That was a major transformation. So when we now talk about Islam and the West, we must have in our mind these two trajectories. What was happening in the Latin Christian world as it evolved, and what is happening in the Middle East Islamic world. And things would change for the Muslims after they lost the Caliphate in 1258. Because what happened then is the Muslims now found themselves in a situation whereby there are many governments that were headed by people who called themselves consciously as Muslims. But that titular head called the Caliph, that was the unifying umbrella, was no longer there. Because the Fatimites would claim the Caliphate in Egypt, and they were Shiites. And then, of course, you have some other people who were survivors of the Mughal onslaught, claiming to be the Caliphate. And of course, then, because the Umayyads were overthrown much earlier by the Abbasid, in Spain, the descendants of the Umayyad were also claiming to be the Caliphate. So you have these three different centers of power. By the way, the same thing happened with the Christians, in the sense that once the Vandals destroyed the Roman Empire and the capital moved to Istanbul, what we call Istanbul today, or Constantinople, you have different popes. You have the Latin popes, and then you have the Greek-speaking pope. It still exists today, because the Eastern Christians, they still have their popes. Of course, Pope John Paul, before he passed away, tried to reconcile the East and the Western branches of the church, hoping to bring them together. But you do have separate papacies. Of course, the most prominent and most widely known is the Roman Catholic Pope. The Muslims, of course, since 1258, found themselves with people who claimed to be caliphs, but they did not enjoy the moral authority or the political power of the original caliphs. And that continued in diminishing order until 1914 through 18, World War I, when the Ottomans were defeated, and in 1924, Ataturk abolished the institution altogether. So even that figurehead that was maintained since 1258 became non-existent at all, was completely just wiped out. So since that abolition of the caliphate, there were caliphate movements in India and what is now called Pakistan, tried to push for the restoration of the caliphate during that particular period. But the movement never materialized because the Turks under Ataturk decided not to go that way. But there are still people who have this idea of creating a unified Islam with a caliphate. And of course, in America, we have some young Muslims who used to talk about California. Because California, so I mean, but the thing is, when you really talk about Islam and the West, therefore, you have to bear in mind these two different trajectories. And I try to make this very clear so you can see what was happening in Europe and what was happening in the Middle East and the Muslim world. Now,